Greetings. Today I would like to talk about what I regard as the relative ahistoricity of our time. Now, I use the word ahistoricity, I'll explain why in greater detail in a bit, because for quite some time now, many people have drawn parallels between the past, historic events, and the times we're living in today. And history can, in fact, be a wise teacher. I would be one of the first people to say this, in fact. But I think we can be easily led astray by what might be deemed historical parallels versus the actuality of our current situation. Now, there are some historical parallels that are arguably virtual replicates of what we've seen in the past. I mean, I think one good example of this would be what's often referred to historically as the Russian winter. I mean, jokingly, General Snow or General Frost. There have been several armies throughout history that have fallen prey to the viciousness and inhospitable nature of the Russian winter. The most common examples, the two most common, are, of course, the French invasion, Napoleonic invasion of 1812, and then you have the German invasion of 1941. But there were others. I think a lot of people don't know this, but Sweden used to be an aggressor nation, and I believe in 1707, 1708, off the top of my head, Charles the 12th invaded Russia and lost more than half his army because he just couldn't deal with the winter and his forces couldn't. So there have been a number of, you could call them sort of historically replicated attempts at invading and conquering various bits of Russia that have failed due to General Frost or the Russian winter. And, of course, in the nitty-gritty of the details, there are differences, but by and large, the causal factors involved in these defeats, whether it was the Swedish invasion of the 18th century, Napoleonic one of the 19th, or the Allied intervention in the early 20th and later on with the German invasion in the 40s, there's a common thread, the inhospitable winter, the brutal climate, etc., etc. We're talking about negative 30, negative 35 degrees Celsius in some cases, so not exactly the most pleasant of climates. However, I think we are remiss if we attempt to draw too many parallels by citing things like that, say the Russian winter, which was a repetitive and causally linked factor in the defeat of armies, to other things. And I noticed this trend years and years ago, and admittedly I bought into it myself, I'd say in the early 2000s when I was a somewhat young man, in the discussion and talk about ancient Rome, and very specifically about inflation, hyperinflation, and these parallels that people would draw, which were clipping of coins and trying to devalue the currency. And I got on board with that for a while. And then, as time went on more generally, people drawing various analogies between the current time we live in and then Rome in its more dilapidated and fallen state. But I think what happens when we draw parallels is we forget certain things. What is a parallel? Well, we know the technical definition of parallel, obviously. But a parallel is, in fact, a verisimilitude of something. It is a seeming identical likeness of something, effectively. But this verisimilitude is not the same thing. And repeatedly throughout the red pillosphere, if you want to refer to it as such, there's a notion that we are facing imminent collapse and just total destruction across the board, if not very soon, then in the ensuing decades. As I think about this topic and cast my eyes upon the landscape and look at history, at least for the nonce, I am a bit skeptical of this. Now, people cite, for example, the French Revolution, mass chaos, etc., etc. And there were, to be sure, there were several factors involved in the escalation and culmination of what we refer to as French Revolution. There were social causes, the bourgeoisie, financial ones, overextending finances vis-a-vis participation in the New World, particularly French backing of the American Revolution. Of course, cultural stuff regarding the Enlightenment. And then economic stuff. There were grain shortages and led to higher prices of bread. Now, what I want to propose to you, this is a specific example, because people think, well, surely there's going to be some kind of equivalent of a peasant revolt in the current year. Well, I find this dubious, and I'll tell you why. Because inevitably, the straw that breaks the camel's back in a historical context, and I think more importantly, to be very specific, in a human context, is the deprivation of essential resources. By essential, I mean food, water, and shelter. So yes, there was a range of factors contributing to the French Revolution, a range of factors contributing to all sorts of social forms of social and political turmoil. But the kind of revolt style that characterized past revolutions and the destruction and violence that ensued and occurred concordantly, well, I just don't really see this happening. And I'll tell you simply why. I mean, I talked about this, I believe, in a somewhat, I guess, arcane video about the Ludi, the games of Rome. Now, even as Rome was suffering financially and suffering the resource department, people would still prop up the entertainment. It's particularly true in the 3rd century AD onwards, because despite Diocletian's reforms, the empire, it was a band-aid solution. Diocletian, as a person, and his proposals were band-aid solutions. Long-term was going to last. But the games were important to keep the mobs and the turba, the masses, the vulgar masses, that's the turba in Latin, satisfied, or rather sated. And why do I say sated instead of satisfied? To correct myself. I think we live in a time, the current year, the current decade, and the foreseeable future, where people are sated but not satisfied. They're contented but not content. Well, wherein lies the difference? Satisfaction implies a degree of happiness, contentment. To content oneself with something does not imply either satisfaction or contentment. It means accepting it as enough. There's a good German term for this, sich mit etwas begnügen. And I think etymologically it cuts the issue a lot more precisely in English. But in any event, if you content yourself with a job, you might not be miserable, but you might not love it. In fact, it's very unlikely that you do. If you are sated on greasy New York-style pizza, which occasionally can be nice and tasty, mind you, well, it doesn't mean that you're satisfied. You're full. You probably covered your nutritional requirements for a few days if you had a few slices, but they're not coterminous. They're not the same thing, and even though there's overlap. And what I'm proposing here is, namely, that violent revolts and mass problems of the sort that can be witnessed throughout history, going well into antiquity, the Middle Ages, and well into modernity, these are things that really ultimately occurred due to deprivation of the absolutely necessary resources that human beings require. Not, which is to say, the revolting peasants of the turba that revolted during the French Revolution, they were neither sated nor contented. They were discontent, and they were not satisfied. But the question that I would pose to you, as I pose to myself, is, does the sated man, the man who contents himself with something, does he rebel? Does he revolt? Does he strive against the powers that be? As a rule, I would say no. The sated man who contents himself with something is just that. It's just enough to survive and get by. And if we look upon the landscape that we currently dwell in, I would argue that we live in a landscape of the sated and contented. It's enough for most people. The equivalent would be the Ludi of ancient Rome or late antiquity. But the problem with the Ludi, the analogy rather, is that it's not a perfect analogy. It's a parallel. And as I said, parallels are verisimilitudes of a sort. They're not the same thing. And where the parallel or the verisimilitude of the Roman ludi, let's say modern forms of entertainment, fails, where it falls apart, is the fact that our ludi, be it video games or cinema or television programs or whatever it might be that we can find on the internet through surfing, through me phones, etc., it's all omnipresent. It's all readily available to virtually anyone. And unlike the deprivations poor people or people who have just been oppressed in the past had suffered from, there were just vast disparities. Now, these days, most of the disparities that we can observe are, I would argue, disparities of degree. So maybe you're working some job and it requires you a year and a half or 2 years to save up for some gadget, maybe a gaming laptop. And some guy who's far wealthier could buy it within a week. Well, fair enough. It would take you a while to get there. But it is a question of degree and not accessibility. Capitalism and free markets have irrevocably changed the financial landscape that we inhabit and we can view. And so I don't really see an exact parallel or even, well, it's a verisimilitude. As I said, it's not the same thing. As long as modern man is sated and contents himself with the present and all the things that he has access to, we will not see, I think, an overturning of the established order. And thus my answer to the question that people often pose, either out loud or to themselves or if posed to me, what are these managerial elites doing? Are they not thinking about these things? Are they not looking at the mirror of history? Well, I suspect they probably have done, but have drawn not too dissimilar conclusions, which is to say, as long as you keep the vulgar masses sated, and they are contented with whatever might float their boat, a Netflix film or a Justice League film or a video game that is entertaining, and they can run around the corner, or rather walk around the corner to the supermarket and chug down a bottle of Coca-Cola or throw in a microwave pizza and sate themselves, even until they're glutted. Well, that's another point. Is a glutted person inclined to revolt? Probably not. Well, I don't really see any of the things that people worry about anytime soon. I don't think so this will go on in perpetuity, but I think we're looking at a rather long time frame, in fact, if you take the perspective on that I am advocating here. Because the vulgar masses have their ludi across the board. There's no inclination to revolt when you're contented with what you have. Of course, you might want to strive for more, but it really is the absolute deprivation of the essential resources that human beings need and require to survive and exist and reproduce that brings on these cataclysmic events that we can bear witness to by studying history. Not so much in the present, barring, of course, a complete failure and collapse of the economic ecosystem and consumerism and what have you. No, what I think is going to happen is more of the same. We will see continually the occasional paroxysm of peace, as I've come to refer to it. People will get upset about that and move on. Once the paroxysm of peace has passed, we'll see a few more shootings in the land of the brave, the land of the free. But other stuff, not so much. And once again, look at the mirror of history to get an idea of what goes on. So why, whatever your thoughts, particular thoughts on National Socialism might be, why was it successful? Why was it so attractive? Was it because of the truth content? Does this Wahrheitsgehaltswegen? No. Of National Socialism. I don't think so. And I mean, obviously there's some people that believe in the Wahrheitsgehalt of National Socialism, but clearly there were preceding events. Hyperinflation of the sort that I think is very, very unlikely to occur in the current year and in our era. The famous description of wheelbarrows full of money. And prior to that, in the Weimar Republic, and prior to that, of course, the extreme cruelty of the deprivations imposed on by the Treaty of Versailles. And so you end up in a situation where people are deprived, effectively, of the things that they needed. And that's when extremism, whatever your particular views of National Socialism might be, becomes attractive, because if you can pitch something from an angle of, oh, well, we'll give you X and Y and Z, jobs, food, shelter, other things that human beings need, then it works. It's also why I don't think that the so-called identitarian movements, whatever their particular nature might be, in the current era will be successful either, because people are sated, in some cases glutted, and they're contented with what they have. Now, if you could create a scenario of mass deprivation, starvation, theft, etc., then yeah, you get tons of people on board to do all kinds of things, including mass murder, for what I reckon. But we're not even there. Not even close. Not yet. The entire infrastructure of the modern economy would have to implode in itself to get there, I think. So, effectively, what we're facing is a kind of ahistoricity that is uniquely, in the history of mankind, applicable to our time. Never before have we had such abundance. Never before have we had so much satedness, as it were. And never before could you content yourself with the bare minimal as being enough. And the bare minimal is a bar that has been raised substantially. The bare minimal these days is a computer, internet access, food, shelter, that regardless, das sowieso. But all of these things combined create a type of human being that really isn't in a position to really want to do anything to change the status quo. What if, and this is a thought maybe some people might have, if ruptures to the status quo would deprive these people of the very things that have rendered them sated and contented to begin with? No, I mean, there are some, obviously, there are some instigators, people in Antifa and what have you, or that have dream of some strange paradisical vision of what could be if only X were accomplished. But I don't think they're the majority. I do not think they represent the majority of really anyone in the West. And so when I look out at the future, the landscape of the future, I see a kind of moribund ennui that has captured us. An ahistorical ennui. Just more of the same. More paroxysms of peace, the occasional shooting. Someone might get angry about Islam. X party might get 2% more in some vote, and that's regarded as some type of progress, etc., etc. But hugely impactful events of the sort that we can see in the 20th century and all the way back to the dawn of civilization, I'm not saying that it's done. And this is not, by the way, the Whig view of history. I'm being very specific here. It's just the circumstances and the environment we've been born into and are surrounded by give us enough such that we are just not inclined to engage in those types of activities. Now, this doesn't change the fact that people are looking for more than that. As Jordan Peterson points out frequently, people are looking for meaning. And some people find it in various ways. Some people find it in the extreme left. Some people find it even in hobbies. Some people in various identitarian movements, etc., etc. But none of these are particularly good solutions long term. And as I said, as long as the system remains intact, as it is, and you can go to the supermarket to buy your, I don't know what a microwave pizza costs, because I don't consume that stuff, but assuming it costs, I don't know, $2 or $3, you're good to go. I mean, if you live off welfare, I know lots of people that live off welfare in multiple countries. You can have a good life that way, relatively speaking, certainly in terms of standards compared to the days of yore. So, That is, I'm not a prophet, but I think that's my prediction for the foreseeable future. Foreseeable, mind you. Will it be this way in 200 years or even 100? I doubt it. For the next 4 or 5, perhaps even 6 decades, something of this sort. A kind of dull throbbing, a very slow, almost painful passing of time, but not quite enough pain to jolt people into action, to galvanize people. That is the vision I see. A vision of the ahistorical and a vision of ennui. The question is, how long will this last? I don't know, but I don't see this imminent collapse coming about anytime soon. People are discontented with their lives, with eating, shitting, and fucking, and watching Netflix. It's never been the case before. No. Today, these days, it's different. Different. And not that somewhat morose note, if you wish to call it, that I will bid you adieu. More to come, assuming I'm alive and hale. Number of scripted videos I'm working on off and on, sort of jumping from one to the next. And yes, you will see them and list them as they appear, assuming I'm still alive, of course. So, I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and for what it's worth, take care, and may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.